I have lived on Willow Creek Farm for nearly 15 years now. The property has been in my family for 3 generations, passed down from my grandfather to my father, and finally to me. 40 acres of rolling pastures, a small apple orchard, and the weathered red barn that stands as the heart of our operation. The land speaks to me in ways city folk never understand: the subtle changes in soil color telling stories of rainfall patterns, the whispers of wind through tall grass signaling weather shifts, the morning dew patterns revealing what creatures visited overnight. My morning routine rarely changes regardless of season. I wake before sunrise, pull on work clothes worn soft from years of use, and head out to begin chores while most of the world still sleeps. There is something sacred about those early hours when the mist hovers just above the ground and the only sounds are animals stirring in anticipation of breakfast. My boots leave dark imprints in the damp earth as I make my way to the barn each dawn. The barn itself deserves special mention, not because it is particularly grand or architecturally significant, but because it represents the beating heart of everything I do here. Its weathered red boards have witnessed births, deaths, celebrations, and heartbreaks. Inside those walls, I store not just equipment and feed, but family history. My grandfather built the main structure with his own hands in 1957. My father added the eastern extension in the summer of 1982. I reinforced the roof and replaced the south wall after a particularly brutal winter storm 5 years ago. Among the animals that call Willow Creek home, Thunderbolt the ram stands apart from the others. I acquired him as a lamb 6 years ago, the runt of a triplet birth that the mother rejected. I hand-raised him on bottles, spending countless nights in the barn ensuring his survival. Perhaps that unnatural beginning created our unusual bond. Unlike most rams who merely tolerate human presence, Thunderbolt seeks it out. He follows me around the property like an oversized dog, coming when called, and oddly enough, displaying protective behaviors I have never seen in other sheep. The protective nature intensified after a coyote attack 3 years back. We lost 2 ewes that night before I could respond to the commotion. Thunderbolt sustained injuries defending the flock, deep gashes across his face that healed into impressive scars. After that incident, he developed a peculiar habit of positioning himself near entryways, particularly the main barn door, watching for potential threats with unusual vigilance. Visitors often comment on his intimidating presence. 280 pounds of muscle, topped by impressive spiral horns that add another foot to his height. My relationship with neighbors had always been amicable if not close. Rural communities operate on unspoken rules of respect and distance. We help when help is needed, share equipment during harvest, and otherwise respect property boundaries. That comfortable equilibrium remained undisturbed until last spring, when the Henderson property adjacent to mine sold after sitting vacant for nearly 2 years. I first noticed the moving trucks on a Tuesday morning, 3 large vehicles kicking up dust clouds on the rarely used access road. From my vantage point atop the tractor, I could see people scurrying about with furniture and boxes. Nothing unusual about new neighbors, I thought, returning focus to the field I was preparing for planting. It was only later that afternoon when I caught my first glimpse of her. She stood at the property line where her manicured lawn met my natural field grasses. Perfectly styled blonde hair caught the afternoon sun, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, white pants and blue blouse that looked more suited to a country club than actual country living. What caught my attention most was her expression as she surveyed my property. The slight curl of her lip, the narrowed eyes behind those expensive frames, the way she took photographs with her phone while shaking her head in disapproval. When her gaze locked onto my barn, something in my chest tightened with unease. I cannot explain the premonition I felt watching her stare at my beloved structure with such obvious distaste. Her fingers moved rapidly over her phone screen, making notes or sending messages. Something told me that the peaceful rhythm of my rural existence was about to face a challenge unlike any storm or drought or market fluctuation I had previously weathered. The first direct encounter happened at the monthly farmers market in town. I maintain a small stall there, selling honey from my beehives, fresh eggs, and seasonal produce. The market operates from an old warehouse downtown, a gathering place where locals catch up on community news while browsing homegrown offerings. I was arranging a display of early summer squash when a shadow fell across my table. "Are these organi?" See, the voice carried a tone that suggested doubt before I could even answer. I looked up to find the new neighbor standing before my humble display. Up close, the contrast between us was even more pronounced. Her clothing likely cost more than my monthly feed bill. Manicured nails, salon-highlighted hair, and an expression of barely concealed disdain as she surveyed my produce. Yes, Mom, everything here is grown without chemicals. Been farming that way for 15 years now. I offered my hand in greeting. James Miller, I believe we are neighbors. Your property borders my north pasture. She hesitated before taking my hand with the lightest possible touch. Patricia Westfield, though most people call me Pat. Her smile never reached her eyes. So you are the owner of that quaint farm operation I see from my back porch. The way she said quaint made it sound like a synonym for backward or primitive. She picked up a zucchini, examined it with suspicion, then placed it back with exaggerated care. And you actually make a living doing this. Before I could respond, her attention shifted to something behind me. My market helper that day was my teenage nephew, who had brought along a photo album showing our recent lambing season to share with regular customers who enjoyed seeing the animals. You keep livestock right next to residential properties, her tone sharpened. Are there regulations about that sort of thing around here? The entire area is zoned agricultural with residential permitted, I explained calmly, already sensing the direction this conversation was heading. Most properties in our valley are working farms or ranches, has been that way for generations. Patricia made a sound between a scoff and a laugh. Well, that explains the smell, I suppose. My husband and I moved here for the charming rural atmosphere, not to live next door to a petting zoo. She departed without purchasing anything, leaving behind an uneasy feeling that clung to me throughout the day. Other vendors who overheard the exchange offered sympathetic glances. Old Bill Henderson from the honey stall leaned over during a quiet moment. Watch that one, James. Heard she came from that fancy development outside the city. Those types move to the country for the view, but want to change everything that makes it country. His warning proved prophetic sooner than expected. The following week brought the annual community potluck at the Grange Hall. I arrived with my traditional contribution of smoked brisket and spotted Patricia immediately. She had gathered a small audience of newer residents, gesturing animatedly while speaking. As I passed by to place my dish on the serving table, snippets of her conversation reached me. Property values are our primary concern. Aesthetic standards must be maintained. A beautification initiative for the valley. Some operations are simply eyesores. When she noticed me, her voice trailed off momentarily before she pivoted to address me directly. James, we were just discussing community improvement projects. Your perspective as a traditional farmer would be valuable. The conversation that followed felt like navigating a minefield. Patricia spoke of concerns about how certain properties affected the marketability of homes in the area, how outdated agricultural practices might deter the right kind of growth the region needed, all while maintaining a smile that never warmed her eyes. Have you considered updating that barn of yours? She asked between bites of potato salad. A fresh coat of paint would do wonders, perhaps something in a more contemporary style. The weathered look is so dated. That weathered look represents 60 years of standing against every storm nature has thrown at it, I replied, struggling to keep my tone conversational. My grandfather built it, my father expanded it, and I maintain it. The patina tells its story. Patricia tilted her head slightly. How sentimental. But surely progress requires occasional sacrifices of the old ways, does it not? Days later, she appeared at my property line while I worked on mending fences. Arms crossed, designer sunglasses in place despite the cloudy day, she waited until I acknowledged her presence. Do your roosters always need to announce sunrise quite so enthusiastically? She asked without preamble. Some people appreciate sleeping past 5 in the morning. Nature keeps its own schedule, I answered, driving another staple into the fence post. Roosters crow at dawn, been happening since roosters existed. And is it necessary to operate that tractor during dinner hours? The noise carries directly into our dining room. My husband was trying to conduct a business call yesterday and had to move inside. Rather than engage in what was clearly becoming a pattern, I attempted a peace offering. Would you and your husband like to visit the farm properly sometime, see the operation up close? Could send you home with some fresh eggs. Her expression suggested I had offered something distasteful. No thank you, we buy organic from the supermarket. She paused, then added what felt like a veiled threat. By the way, my husband knows several people on the county board. Did you know they are reviewing agricultural codes in this district? That comment lingered with me long after she departed. The implication was clear. Connections would be leveraged if necessary to force compliance with her vision of how the neighborhood should function. The warning signs multiplied in the following weeks. I spotted her photographing my property from the road multiple times. She made phone calls while pointing toward different structures on my land. Formal-looking letters addressed from something called the Valley View Neighborhood Enhancement Committee appeared in my mailbox, listing suggestions for property improvements that read more like demands. Most disturbingly, I began noticing her particular focus on my barn. Her gaze returned to it repeatedly during her surveillance activities. She took multiple photographs from different angles. She even brought what appeared to be a measuring tape to the property line one afternoon, making notes while citing lines toward the structure. During these encounters, Thunderbolt demonstrated his unusual perceptiveness. The ram seemed to sense the tension, often approaching the fence when Patricia was present. He would stamp his front hooves and snort loudly, behaviors typically reserved for threats to his flock. Her reaction to him was particularly telling, disgust mingled with fear, yet underlined with dismissiveness. "That creature looks diseased," she commented once when she noticed me watching her watch Thunderbolt. "Are you certain it meets health regulations for livestock in residential proximity?" "He is in perfect health," I responded, "just protective of his territory. Animals have good instincts about people." She did not appreciate the implication, turning away with a huff. "Your little farm fantasy might be charming to some, but times change, Mr. Miller. This area has potential beyond backward agricultural enterprises." I stood watching her retreat to her property, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The storm clouds were gathering, metaphorically speaking. The comfortable rhythm of rural life was facing disruption from someone who clearly did not understand or respect its underlying principles. Meanwhile, Thunderbolt continued his vigilant watch from the pasture, as if he too sensed the brewing conflict. The first sign something was wrong came on a Thursday afternoon. I had been in town for a few hours picking up supplies and meeting with the local agricultural extension agent about a potential grant program. Nothing seemed amiss when I pulled my truck into the gravel driveway, but experienced farmers develop a sixth sense about their properties. Something felt off in a way I could not immediately identify. The first concrete evidence appeared as I approached the north pasture gate. The chain was secured differently than how I had left it, wrapped once around the post instead of twice, the padlock facing outward rather than inward as was my habit. Small details perhaps, but they stood out like alarm bells to someone who performs the same routine daily. Inside the gate, further discrepancies accumulated. The feed buckets in the sheep pen had been moved from their usual position. A wheelbarrow stood at an odd angle against the equipment shed rather than inside it where I always stored it. Most concerning, the animals showed signs of agitation. The chickens clustered nervously in the corner of their run. The sheep bunched together in defensive formation rather than grazing across the pasture as they normally would on a pleasant afternoon. Thunderbolt displayed the most obvious distress. The ram paced the perimeter of his enclosure, head lowered in the posture he adopted when sensing predators nearby. When he saw me, he let out a deep bleating sound that carried clear notes of warning. I had never seen him this unsettled without clear cause. The barn door provided the final confirmation that someone had been on my property. I always secured it with both the sliding bolt and the padlock, but found it closed with only the bolt, the padlock hanging open from its hasp. Inside, the evidence became undeniable. Items had been disturbed throughout the space. Feed bags examined, their ties secured differently than my method. The cabinet where I kept veterinary supplies stood partially open, contents rearranged. Tools on my workbench had been moved, some placed in incorrect positions. Nothing appeared to be missing, which somehow made the intrusion more unsettling. This was not a theft but an inspection. Someone had methodically examined my operation, looking for something specific. Given recent interactions, I had little doubt who that someone me. GHTB. The violation of unspoken rural boundaries demanded response. That evening, I drove to the hardware store in town and purchased a security camera system, something I had never before felt necessary on my property. The salesman seemed surprised by my request. "Having trouble out at Willow Creek?" he asked while ringing up the considerable purchase. "Not like you to go in for this sort of thing, James." "New neighbors," I replied simply. He nodded in understanding, needing no further explanation. The installation took most of the following day. Weather-resistant cameras positioned to cover key entry points, the barn interior, equipment areas, and the main house approaches. The system connected to my phone, allowing remote monitoring when I was away from the property. The presence of these electronic eyes felt foreign and uncomfortable, an admission that the trust inherent in rural living had been compromised. The wait for evidence proved brief. 3 days after installation, while reviewing footage from the previous afternoon when I had been delivering produce to local restaurants, the cameras captured undeniable proof. Patricia Westfield, dressed in khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt rather than her usual designer attire, moved methodically across my property. She carried a clipboard, making notes as she examined various structures. She tested doors, peered through windows, and photographed what appeared to be potential code violations from her perspective. Most disturbing was her attempt to enter the barn. The footage showed her struggling briefly with the padlock before discovering the sliding bolt offered less resistance. She managed to open it just enough to peek inside before apparently changing her mind and securing it again before departure. Throughout her inspection, her expression remained coldly analytical, as if surveying a problem requiring solution rather than a neighbor's private property. I watched the footage 3 times to be certain of what I was seeing. The brazenness of the trespass left me both angry and concerned about escalation. If boundaries meant so little to her now, what might come next? The decision to confront her directly was not made lightly, but seemed necessary to establish clear lines that should not be crossed. The following morning, clipboard in hand with printed screenshots from the security footage, I walked the quarter-mile to the Westfield property. Their house stood in stark contrast to my weathered farmhouse, newly painted in fashionable gray with white trim, landscaping that appeared designed to mimic magazine spreads rather than accommodate the local climate, and a circular driveway of fresh pavers leading to the 3-car garage. Patricia answered the door dressed as if for a casual luncheon rather than a morning at home. Her smile of greeting froze when she recognized me, then transformed into a mask of polite inquiry. "Mr. Miller, this is unexpected. Is there something I can help you with?" "We need to discuss your visit to my property yesterday," I stated plainly, holding up the clipboard with the printed images. "You entered my land without permission, attempted to access my buildings, and disturbed my animals. That constitutes trespassing." Her expression cycled rapidly through surprise, denial, and finally a calculated defensiveness. "I certainly did no such thing. Why would I have any interest in your agricultural situation?" I turned the clipboard toward her, revealing the clear images of her examining my barn door. "The cameras do not lie, Mrs. Westfield. This is you on my property without invitation or permission." For several seconds, she seemed to calculate her options before settling on a new approach. As a member of the Neighborhood Beautification Committee, I was simply conducting a standard assessment. It is perfectly normal procedure. "There is no official Neighborhood Beautification Committee in this unincorporated area," I countered. "And even if there were, it would have no authority to enter private property without permission." Her facade of politeness cracked slightly, revealing the contempt beneath. "Someone needs to address the declining standards in this area. I counted at least 15 potential code violations on your property alone. The county authorities will be very interested in my findings." "The next time you have concerns, you can call me directly," I responded, handing her my business card. "But step foot on my property uninvited again, and I will not hesitate to involve the sheriff. Rural communities take trespassing seriously, Mrs. Westfield. Are you threatening me? She asked, voice rising slightly. Not at all, just clarifying boundaries that should be respected. Her parting words lingered in the air between us. Expect to hear from officials who actually matter in this county, Mr. Miller. Your outdated operation is living on borrowed time. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink hues. The beauty contrasted sharply with the unease I felt. For generations, my family had lived on this land without locks or cameras, secure in the knowledge that neighbors respected each other's space and livelihood. Now I found myself wondering what rural paradise might be lost to this conflict. Inside the barn, visible through the partially open door, Thunderbolt stood in his pen watching me with those intelligent eyes. The ram seemed to share my concern, his usual calm replaced by watchful alertness. Something had changed in our peaceful valley, and both man and beast could sense the approaching storm. The white county vehicles appeared on my driveway exactly 8 days after my confrontation with Patricia. 2 identical government SUVs with the county seal on their doors crawled up the gravel path, moving with the hesitant pace of outsiders unfamiliar with rural properties. From my position near the chicken coop, I watched them approach while continuing to distribute feed. No sense appearing concerned, though my stomach tightened at their arrival. 2 men emerged from the lead vehicle. Both wore khaki uniforms with county patches, carried clipboards, and moved with the measured confidence of officials executing routine duties. From the second vehicle, a woman in similar attire appeared, immediately pulling out a camera with a long lens. Their demeanor suggested this was not a social call but an inspection. Looking past them toward the property line, I spotted Patricia Westfield standing on her side of the boundary. Arms crossed over her chest, designer sunglasses in place, her posture radiated smug satisfaction. She made no attempt to disguise her observation of the proceedings about to unfold. I set down the feed bucket and approached the officials with practiced calm. "Morning, gentlemen. What brings county services out to Willow Creek Farm today?" The older of the 2 men stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Miller, I am Harold Peterson, County Code Enforcement. This is my colleague Jeff Barnes and our documentation specialist Sandra Wilson. We are responding to several anonymous complaints about potential code violations on this property." Anonymous, the word hung in the air between us while I shook his hand. We both knew precisely where the complaints had originated, though the procedural fiction would be maintained. "What sort of violations are we talking about?" I asked, guiding them away from the house toward the central yard area. Peterson consulted his clipboard. "We have reports of improper waste management, unauthorized structures, setback violations, potential water contamination issues, and livestock housing too close to residential boundaries, among others." The inspection lasted nearly 3 hours. They measured distances between structures and property lines, photographed drainage systems, examined chemical storage in the equipment shed, and paid particular attention to the barn that Patricia seemed most focused on. Throughout the process, I accompanied them, answering questions honestly while providing context about traditional farming practices that often predated many of the codes they were enforcing. "This equipment shed appears to be 15 feet from the property line," Barnes noted while making marks on his clipboard. "Current code requires 20 feet minimum setback." "The shed has stood in that location for 37 years, I explained. "It predates the current setback requirements by decades." Peterson nodded. "Likely grandfathered in then. We will need to verify the building date against code implementation." Similar conversations repeated throughout the property. The drainage system near the barn received particular scrutiny. "This runoff pattern could potentially impact groundwater," Peterson observed, photographing the slight slope that directed rainfall away from the structure. "That drainage design was implemented by the Soil Conservation District 15 years ago," I countered. "They considered it best practice for this soil type and gradient." The inspection resulted in a list of minor violations, nothing that threatened immediate sanctions, but enough to require response and investment to remedy. The drainage issue, chemical storage that needed updated containment protocols, documentation required to verify grandfathered status of several structures, a question about the distance between the sheep pen and the property line shared with the Westfields. As the officials prepared to depart, I glanced toward the neighboring property. Patricia remained in her observation post, phone in hand, likely documenting the entire proceedings. Her persistence was almost admirable in its single-minded focus. "These complaints," I ventured carefully to Peterson as he finalized his notes. "Have you received similar ones about other properties in the area?" He maintained professional neutrality, B. At his brief glance toward the property line spoke volumes. "We are required to investigate all complaints received, Mr. Miller. Some areas do see more activity than others." After their departure, Patricia's surveillance intensified. Her cell phone camera appeared whenever I worked outside, documenting my activities from across the property line. When I moved equipment, she recorded. When I repaired fencing, she took photographs. The barn received special attention, her lens focusing on it repeatedly as if searching for new violations to report. The financial impact of addressing the citations stretched my already tight farm budget. Materials for the updated chemical containment system alone cost nearly $800. Documentation fees for the grandfathered structures added several hundred more. Each expense represented money that should have gone toward winter feed stockpiles or equipment maintenance. Seeking perspective, I arranged coffee with Bill Henderson, whose family had farmed in the valley for over 70 years. We met at the small diner in town, away from prying eyes and cameras. "Not surprised to hear about your troubles, James," Bill commented, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Patricia Westfield has been making waves throughout the community since her arrival." "You have heard other stories?" I asked. Bill nodded grimly. "The Johnsons over on County Line Road got hit with noise complaints about their tractor. The Martins were cited for their processing shed being visible from the road. Old Weber had to tear down a perfectly good storage building because she complained it blocked her view of the mountains." "Is anyone pushing back?" I questioned. "Most folks just try to accommodate enough to make her move on to the next target." Bill leaned forward. "But there is something you should know. This is not her first rodeo. My daughter did some internet digging. The Westfields have owned 3 different properties in the last 6 years. Each time, they leave amid conflicts with neighbors or local authorities." That evening, following Bill's suggestion, I conducted my own research. Social media revealed the pattern clearly. A community Facebook group from their previous location contained lengthy threads about that woman who tried shutting down the community garden with unmistakable references to Patricia. A local news article from their residents before that mentioned conflicts between new residents seeking stricter property regulations and established community members, with the Westfields quoted prominently. The pattern was clear. They moved to rural or semi-rural areas, then immediately began campaigning to reshape them according to suburban standards and aesthetics. When sufficient conflict developed, they sold at a profit and moved to the next target. It was less about living in these communities than transforming or exploiting them. Standing in the evening light, watching my breath form visible clouds in the cooling autumn air, the weight of defending my livelihood settled heavily. The Westfields represented not just a nuisance, but a genuine threat to a way of life practiced here for generations. This land, these buildings, these animals were not merely assets, but heritage, the physical manifestation of values and knowledge passed down through my family. Thunderbolt approached the fence line, pressing his woolly head against my hand in silent solidarity. The ram's intelligent eyes seemed to understand the situation better than many humans might. Something would need to change, and soon. This conflict had evolved beyond neighborly disagreement to an existential challenge to everything I had built and maintained. Dawn revealed disaster in stark morning light. I had risen at my usual hour, pulled on work clothes, and stepped outside to begin chores only to stop short at the sight before me. The John Deere tractor, my most essential and expensive piece of equipment, sat in the equipment yard with fuel pouring from severed lines, forming dark puddles on the packed earth beneath. Nearby, the irrigation pump that supplied water to the eastern fields had been damaged, its control panel hanging open with wires exposed. A quick survey of the property revealed further sabotage. 2 sections of fence in the north pasture had been cut, allowing 3 sheep to wander onto neighboring land. The lock on the feed storage had been broken, bags slashed open, contents exposed to overnight moisture rendering them unusable. The destruction appeared methodical rather than random, targeting systems critical to farm operations. The security cameras should have captured the perpetrators, but review of the footage yielded only shadowy figures moving through blind spots in the system. Someone with knowledge of the camera placement had carefully avoided direct exposure. The timing between camera sweeps suggested they had studied the system's patterns. One brief glimpse showed a figure approximate. Patricia's height and build near the equipment yard, but the face remained obscured by a hooded jacket. Not enough for definitive identification. Officer Reynolds from the County Sheriff's Department arrived 90 minutes after my call. He surveyed the damage with appropriate concern, taking photographs and notes while I estimated repair costs. The fuel line damage alone would require parts I would need to order from the dealer in the next county. The irrigation system might need complete replacement of the control module. This is clearly vandalism, possibly criminal mischief with intent to impair agricultural operations, Reynolds observed, examining the cleanly cut fuel lines. But without clear identification of the perpetrator, our options are limited. I showed him the security footage, pointing out the figure that resembled Patricia. I have had ongoing issues with my neighbor. She has expressed clear hostility toward my operation and was recently caught trespassing on the property. Reynolds sighed, the sound of a man familiar with neighborhood disputes. Without clear facial identification or other definitive evidence, this is circumstantial at best. We can take fingerprints, but unless the person has prints in the system, it may not help much. He promised increased patrols past the property, but left with the frustrating reality hanging in the air. Without clear proof, our hands are tied legally. The financial strain tightened around my operation like a noose. Repairs to the tractor alone would cost nearly $2,000, money that had been earmarked for winter feed purchases. The damaged feed represented another several $100s lost. Farm insurance would cover some costs, but the deductible and inevitable premium increase added to the burden. While awaiting parts for repairs, the conflict escalated in a new venue. The monthly town council meeting, normally a sparsely attended forum for routine municipal matters, saw unprecedented attendance. Word had spread that property standards would be discussed, drawing concerned farmers and ranchers throughout the valley. Patricia Westfield stood to speak during the public comment period, dressed impeccably as if attending a corporate board meeting rather than a small-town gathering. Her presentation, complete with digital slides displayed from her tablet, outlined what she called dangerous, unsanitary agricultural operations, threatening neighborhood health and property values. "We moved to this beautiful valley for its natural charm," she explained to the council members, "not to live next to commercial farming enterprises with their associated odors, noises, and visual pollution." Her supporters, mostly newer residents from suburban backgrounds, nodded along while she displayed photographs of various properties throughout the valley. My barn featured prominently in her presentation, the weathered red wood presented as an eyesore degrading community aesthetics. Generational farmers exchanged knowing glances as she continued. This was not our first encounter with those who viewed rural life through suburban lenses. When the council president opened the floor for responses, several longtime residents rose to defend traditional agricultural practices. The tension in the room grew palpable as the fundamental divide between opposing visions for the valley became clear. The meeting ended without definitive action, the council promising to study the matter further, political speak for delaying controversial decisions. As attendees filed out, Patricia approached me directly, her public smile replaced by cold determination. "The council may hesitate now, but change is inevitable," she stated with quiet confidence. "This area has tremendous development potential once the agricultural restrictions are modified. Progressive voices will prevail eventually." I returned to the farm with her words echoing in my mind. The repair parts would not arrive for another 3 days, leaving me dependent on borrowed equipment from sympathetic neighbors. The damage had created a cascade of delayed work that would take weeks to resolve fully. Each passing day represented lost productivity and income that could not be recovered. 2 days later, returning early from a supply run to find replacement irrigation components, I spotted Patricia's distinctive white SUV parked along the road near my property. Instinct rather than evidence told me something was wrong. I accelerated down the driveway, gravel spraying from beneath my truck tires, and parked haphazardly near the house. Heart pounding, I moved quickly toward the barn, following the same intuition that had guided farmers for generations when their land was threatened. As I rounded the equipment shed, I caught sight of Patricia testing the barn door handle, clipboard, and camera in hand. The new padlock I had installed after the previous intrusion prevented her entry, but her intent was unmistakable. "This is private property," I called out, closing the distance between us with long strides. "You are trespassing again." She startled at my voice but recovered quickly, smoothing her expression into practiced indignation. "I was simply investigating a report of unsafe conditions, as a concerned citizen." "You are not official enforcement," I interrupted, anger rising despite my attempt to remain calm. "You have no authority to enter my property or buildings. This is the second time I have caught you trespassing. The next time involves the sheriff and formal charges." Something in Patricia's carefully maintained facade cracked. The polite veneer peeled away, revealing the raw contempt beneath. "This entire operation violates the vision for this developing area," she snapped, gesturing broadly at the barn and surrounding farm. "People like you need to understand progress. This valley has potential beyond backward agricultural enterprises." "This backward enterprise has fed this community for 3 generations," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the rage building within me, "and will continue doing so long after you have moved on to your next target." Her eyes narrowed at this. "You have been investigating me just as thoroughly as you have been investigating my property." I pointed to the clearly posted signs warning about the ram and other farm animals. "These are here for a reason. Thunderbolt is protective of this barn. He weighs nearly 300 pounds and has put people in the hospital before. This is not a petting zoo." Patricia scoffed, her dismissal complete. "Your little farm animal does not scare me. I will be back with officials who actually matter." She stormed toward her vehicle, designer boots inappropriate for farm terrain causing her to slip slightly on the uneven ground. I watched her departure, hands shaking with the effort of containing my anger. The confrontation represented a turning point. Any pretense of neighborly coexistence had evaporated, replaced by open hostility and threat. Inside the barn, visible through the slats in the wall, Thunderbolt watched the scene unfold with unusual attentiveness, his powerful body tense as if sensing the conflict directed at his domain. That night, securing the property before bed, I added additional locks to the barn door and reinforced Thunderbolt's enclosure. The ram had developed an uncanny habit of escaping when agitated, and the last thing I needed was an animal-related incident to give Patricia additional ammunition. As I checked the security camera feeds one final time, the weight of defending my livelihood against this relentless assault settled heavily across my shoulders. The call came at possibly the worst moment imaginable. I was knee-deep in repairs to the irrigation system when my phone rang with the hospital number from 2 counties over. My mother, 78 and stubbornly independent, had suffered what they suspected was a minor stroke. She was stable but asking for me. The doctor recommended I come as soon as possible. Family emergencies create impossible choices for solo farmers. Animals cannot feed themselves, systems cannot run unattended, and vulnerability increases with absence. Yet some priorities transcend even the most pressing agricultural concerns. Mother had supported this farm through decades of hardship.